coming. This is, of course, Eudora's church. There's many other people's church as well. She was buried out of this church. In the funeral service, the preacher looked up at the balcony and said he could see still Eudora's presence there. We all said, really? When? I once played on a church league basketball team made up of players who were too skillless to make the Murrah varsity team. We had jerseys that said Galloway on them. Hap Owen might be here today. He was the only really good player on that team. I was a Ringer First Pres member. We naturally didn't have a team. It would have been too much fun. So I think of Methodists as a kind of rollicking fun bunch. I just wanted you, Joyce, to be oriented here in case you haven't been in church in a long time. Ms. Oates was born in Lockport, New York, and grew up in a farmhouse in Millersport, New York, which is way, way upstate near Buffalo. She went to Syracuse University and to the University, as Eudora did, of Wisconsin. We met in Princeton, where we were both teaching in the late 1970s. She was, until her retirement, Roger S. Berlin Distinguished Professor in the Humanities at Princeton. Joyce is one of our nation's most distinguished and celebrated novelists, short story writers, essayists, poets, critics, playwrights, I don't know what else, synchronized swimmers. She's won the National Book Award, the National Medal for Humanities, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Book Critics Circle, the Penn Malamud Award for the short story. Our mutual friend, John Updike, said about Joyce, and I'll quote him here, "Not since Faulkner has an American writer seemed so mesmerized by a field of imaginary material and so headstrong in the cultivation of that field." It's true. It's absolutely true. You and I have been friends, pals, a great long time, so welcome back.
Thank you.
So, all right, we're going to dive in here, nosedive. I'm going to read my questions because I want to get the real good stuff out of this, not just whether you write with a pencil or pen. Okay? You said something to me the other day about the first time that you went to Eudora's house over on Pinehurst Street, and you said that in the aftermath of that visit a year or so ago, that you considered writing, I think you said, a novella about it. And it made me wonder, what is it that makes you decide to write something at all?
Well, I probably speak for all writers that it's a sort of magical and intuitive feeling that you have. I have a sense like of something exciting or thrilling, almost a sense of the forbidden, like a door that you have to push open and go through. So when I was brought into the Eudora Welty house, I just had that feeling of excitement. I think it can very often be issued out of a place. It could be a geographical place. It could be I think of Ireland. Ireland is just so evocative of all kinds of literature, especially poetry. Something about Ireland has inspired so many people, the way it looks, the way it feels, the lighting and the atmosphere. And we have that feeling in Faulkner and in the whole Mississippi sense of the Faulknerian Mississippi, and definitely Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor. Maybe all great writers have that sense that there's something beyond themselves that sort of comes up out of the very soil and mesmerizes one. So when I was taken to the Eudora Welty house, and I know that you've been there, and probably you've all been there, as soon as I saw it, I had that feeling. It's almost of identification, even though you've never seen a place before. You feel that, well, I might have lived there, or I might have been a friend, or I might have been a relative or a cousin. I could have known her like in grade school. Some feeling of kinship that's very hard to explain. It almost sounds mystical, but I think it's intuitive. So then being led into the house, I sort of felt, it did remind me of houses of that era that my relatives owned, maybe an aunt or my grandmother. And it just seemed that I was being brought back into something that was both very new and original, but also familiar. And so I just felt that real sense of excitement and identification. Each room, and I could sort of, I see it very vividly in my mind's eye, and going through the house and going upstairs and seeing that kitchen, the bathroom, different rooms, and the books out, and the fireplace, and then the back of the house and the grounds, was all both romantically new and original, but also in this way mysteriously familiar. So I immediately had this idea of a young woman who would be like Eudora Welty, but also an amalgam of myself, you know, which is what writers do. And she would have some relative in town, a young girl, like a cousin, who would be very different from her. And the whole dynamic would be having to do with a writer vis-a-vis her material, like a person who wasn't a writer, but who was very sensuous and attractive and seductive, and many things that the writer doesn't feel that she would be herself. She's more analytical and bookish and intellectual, and the other would be like a girl, and there'd be a relationship between the two. And I took a lot of notes on it, actually. I probably wrote about 50 pages. But then I was also doing something else, so I had to go back to what I was working on. But I think I will write it sometime, because as I talk about it now, it just sounds so exciting.
Well, yeah, well, you know, I think one of the real problems is it working now?
But I need to make a place for Richard to be in it, because I know you knew Eudora when.
I did.
What were your ages, your relative ages?
Difference in our ages? Well, she went to David School, let's see, 35 years apart.
35
We had
years
the
apart.
same teachers in David School.
I can work it in.
It's now, by the way, it should be said, Barack Obama School, thank goodness.
I can work it in, this young upstart kid.
But you can see, as Joyce spins that out, why writers sometimes seem to be slightly distracted, because all of that stuff's twining out in your head, and there's not sometimes a lot of room for something else.
Well, in terms of the way you write, you have that same feeling of excitement, for instance, when you write about Paris.
Yes, I do.
A place that you don't know that well, you know, sort of know to a degree, but you don't really know it all that well. And so you communicate that sense of a person new to a place, kind of going the wrong way. And it's so much more interesting and convincing than it would be than if a native Parisian wrote about it. He wouldn't be able to write about it that way. You communicate that sense of something uncertain and suspenseful, but also it's very sensuous. Our apprehension of a place that's new to us is sort of myriad stimuli, so it's kind of excitement rather than something that you've already experienced many times.
Hemingway said quite wrongly that we should always write about what we know. What rubbish that is. Can't tell you. I mean, we should really, something Catherine Ann Porter, we were talking about Catherine Ann the other day, she talks in her Paris Review interview about the moment that she decided to write her famous story, The Flower of Judas.
Yeah.
She was just walking down a little paseo in Mexico City in 1921, and she was not a native there in Mexico City, and she spied through a window a very large Mexican man in a military uniform, kneeling in front of a very beautiful woman playing a guitar.
Played a guitar, I remember that. Yeah,
that's all she needed to write The Flowering Judas. She knew nothing of the people.
Yes.
She calls it a commotion in the mind.
That's well put.
Yeah, yeah. A long time ago, 1984, I was living in the Delta in Coahoma County, and I was writing a story called Communist. And I reached a point in the story where I felt the story was ending and should end, and it stopped, but it didn't end. It didn't have the right rhythm. And so I wrote to Joyce, and I said, I sent her this story. I said, something's wrong here. I'm on the brink of failing with this story. And she wrote me back a wonderful line. She said, you need to write some more words. I thought, oh, okay. What words should I write? But it turned out to be genius advice. But can you talk about why that seemed to be a good thing to tell me when I was on the brink of failure?
Well, I probably wouldn't have presumed to actually tell you anything much. I mean, you're a real writer and you sort of do what you're going to do. Sometimes your stories end with a little bit of dialogue. Sometimes they're in somebody's mind it's introspective, the kind of a quiet ending or a more dramatic ending. You do both. I mean, I don't remember now how Communist ends. Is that the one where the says he hasn't seen his mother in a while? Or is that another story?
That's another story, but it basically is the same story.
There's one of your stories in Rock Springs where it says, but I haven't seen her in a while. And it's so touching and sad, but that could almost be the ending of that story.
Yes.
You know, so it's the point of view of a young protagonist who doesn't know exactly what's going on. And you write so well about a boy, an adolescent boy, who doesn't exactly know what's going on in the marriage of his parents. And he's naive in a way that the reader is naive. And so there's this sense of mystery. And that dynamic, I think, is very effective.
What it sent me to do was to go back into my notebooks, because I didn't know what to do, more words. So I went back into my notebook until I found some words. and I found a word, a sentence, which is, a light can go out in the heart.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And so I just stuck it on at the end of my sentence. A light can go out in the heart. And then what I had to do then after that was to tell why that was in the body of the story, tell why that was true and what it meant in terms of the story. So, you know, there's a famous line of Mallarmé telling Degas, who came to Mallarmé saying, I just wrote a wonderful sonnet, it's full of great ideas. And Mallarmé said to Degas, sonnets aren't made of ideas.
Yes, that's right.
They're made of words.
That's right.
So really, in a way, that commotion that we were talking about before is really what it is a call to language. It's something that happens to you, an experience that happens to you that asks you to contribute language. Know what language we decide.
It depends on the writer, too. We're all sort of idiosyncratic. There is a very short story by David Foster Wallace. I think it's called Incarnations of Burnt Children. You know that story? Now, you probably don't know that story as well as we do, because we perhaps have taught it. But it's a story about a young husband and a wife. They're in the kitchen, and the wife, a really very young child who's still wearing a diaper, knocks over boiling water, like scalding water that pours over him, and the story's about 2 or 3 pages long. It happens very, very rapidly, so that it's almost like one long sentence, and it's a horrible emergency situation. You read it very, very quickly, and you come to sort of the end. But then there's a little paragraph at the end that is so weird, because it sort of goes into the future. And I have taught that story, and we just talk about how the decision that a writer would make, like to put the ending that you had on, because maybe some other writer wouldn't have done that.
Oh, no.
You know.
And maybe you wouldn't have done it either if you did it the next day.
Sometimes I have a little sentence like that seems to sum things up in a Joycean way, but sometimes I would have just some dialogue and end it dramatically. There are different ways of writing. I wouldn't say that one way is intrinsically better than the other. Sometimes I encourage my students to hand in different variants, because there are different, like this ending, this has a little bit extra there, this has less, and you kind of look at it. In fact, Ray Carver is a good example. We can see the stories that Gordon Lish edited very, very harshly, and we can see the stories that he wrote. And so that's a good example. And we could have a whole symposium on which story's better. And if Ray Carver himself could comment, he would probably think his own stories were better because they're fuller and they're more him.
I thought they were better.
And yet it's the early stories that Gordon Lish edited that made him famous. Right. So if he'd only written the later stories, he might not have been famous. It's an endlessly intriguing subject. Like, how do you know when you're finished something? Maybe you should add something more. Maybe in a whole other scene. On the other hand, maybe you should cut it back a little because then it's more dramatic. So it's almost what you're going to take a gamble on.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why it's an art and not a science, I guess.
Yeah.
Ruskin said, composition is the arrangement of unequal things. And that's what we do. We put unequal things together and try to make something composed.
Yeah, well, Richard and I are both sometimes published in the New Yorker, which has a certain editing and, copy editing. Now, basically, any magazine that you read, especially, I think, in the past, fits in around the advertisements. So
that's what fiction is.
The advertisements are very important, like in Esquire. Did you publish in Gordon Lish and Esquire in the old days? Yeah.
Yes.
So he would cut things, I'm sure it had to do with the space, and he would cut things pretty harshly. He became famous for being such a harsh editor. But on the other hand, if he didn't have the ads to make him do that, he might not have been the famous editor. It's one of these anomalies. And so both Richard and I think, are edited by the same young woman editor.
Her name is Deborah Treisman.
And she's a wonderful editor, and she's thoughtful, and she has her own ideas. And yet, because it's a magazine, it has space limitations that you're not going to find in a hardcover book. So my question to you, Richard, is, and this is true with the Gordon Lish edited too, when you came to put the stories in your own book, did you put in
the answer to that
edited or your original?
Well, I went back and restored everything that she had taken out. I mean,
That's mostly what I do too.
Lee Eisenberg, who was the editor of Esquire for many years, told me, quite disparagingly, he said, Ford, fiction, it's just the stuff between the ads.
Yeah. Was that Russ Hills?
No, it was Lee Eisenberg. Not a nice man. But he was actually generous to me, so, there we have it, right?
But I think what we're talking about is probably not known to many people because they think that a work that comes out is sort of pristine and comes from the writer's mind, but often it's some collaboration with an editor, and the editor, especially Gordon Lish, he had a kind of power over young writers. If they didn't want to be edited so harshly, then he wouldn't publish them. So I think Ray Carver had to make a decision, and he decided, yes, he would be edited. And isn't there some very sad letter where he's begging Gordon not to tell people this?
Right.
And Gordon does tell people, and I really never forgave that. I thought that was so cruel.
All right, skipping right along.
Yeah, we got on another subject, but it's a subject that writers are interested in. Yeah.
We're going to talk about sense of place now just for a little bit. This is a part of the world that believes place is important, and it believes that it can explain a lot about people. I'm not sure that's right. Eudora, as we all know, has a very famous essay on that subject called Sense of Place in Fiction, which many of you have read. You have written quite a lot of novels and stories which allow you to avail yourself of familiar places where you might have been a child, or where you might have been young, or where you might have gone to college. But in Eudora's essay, she writes something that I'd like to have us talk about just for a minute. She writes in Sense of Place in Fiction, she says, being shown how to locate or to place any account is what does most toward making us believe it. Do you agree with that?
Well, again, it depends on the writer. The one writer that's sort of anomalous in all of this, I think, is Samuel Beckett. People can hear the Irish rhythms in his voice, but basically it's a voice, and it doesn't have a sense of, he doesn't try to evoke a place. Like Waiting for Godot is just a stage, and they're the two actors, It's not the sense that you get from Faulkner or Hemingway up in Michigan, or your writing in Montana or New Jersey, or most of my writing is inspired by some place. And I think that that memorializing a place, certainly that's what John Updike was doing and John Cheever, memorializing the place and trying to evoke the place is so exciting to do. I mean, I write partly to describe a place. So if I was writing about Eudora Welty House, I would be thrilled to be reinventing that in the words and seeing it again. And to me, that would be part of the excitement of doing it. I wouldn't want to just have two people with dialogue and not set in the place. Landscape has a sort of spiritual essence or personality. And that's part of the excitement of writing, is to put that in.
That's not the way I feel about it. But we managed to get stories written, even though we come at them somewhat differently. I feel, someplace I wrote in a book, the line, place means nothing. And that's partly because I spent a long time in my young life trying to shake myself loose of this place a little bit, because not this room here.
But in your writing, place means everything, and it's very, I'm sorry to disagree with him right in front of everybody.
Just not to me.
Well, like the womanizer, for instance, which I reread recently, it's so much a part of this person not knowing what he's doing and walking the wrong way, and not knowing how people are, not knowing what they're saying, like a foreign language. It's so special to that place because he's not really understanding the nuances and things that are being said. How would you evoke that same? And then his wife doesn't like French women. And I mean, there's so many things that depend upon that being set in Paris. To take that story out of the place would be to
Make it another story.
To ruin this. It won't be that story.
But I would think you could make a better story. If I want to, I think if you put it in Berlin or Istanbul.
Well, that's the same thing. I mean, you're taking another place, but You're not getting rid of the place.
I just hate to be dictated to, particularly my choices about what word to write next.
By your own self.
By something that seems, by something that seems somehow riven into the soil.
I wouldn't want to be dictated by you either.
I don't know. It's kind of the old, it's a Southern thing you wouldn't understand. I've been running away from that all my life because I want to write it, and by God, I want you to understand. I don't want you to have to know from which it comes for it to make sense to me.
Now, up in Maine, there's a writer named Elizabeth Strout, and she writes a lot about Maine.
Yeah, she's wonderful.
And she's an excellent writer. She wrote Olive Kittredge, probably a lot of you know that.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And she has another book, Olive Again, which is just coming out, which is about Olive Kittredge again, but she's in her 80s, she's older. But anyway, people have said, and I'm sure it's true, that this is the very spirit of Maine, and that she's writing about people that she's met, and the air, and the water, and the light, and all these things. And it's so wonderful and sensuous and alive because it's set in Maine. My feeling is that regional art is universal art, and that if it's really palpable on that regional level, as with Faulkner, it becomes universal. But if you start off with something that's no place, and it's a vague city, and nobody cares about it, and the writer doesn't really know much about it, then it's probably not going to be universal, and it's probably not going to be anything that the writer herself cares about.
Well, I live in Maine, and I don't think Maine has a spirit at all.
You don't live in small town Maine. You live in sort of upscale, affluent Maine.
I hope so.
She lives in small town Maine where everybody went to school with one another, and you know your high school teacher, and everybody's getting older, and people have all these scandals. And so it's more like the small town, but it's also Maine, and that's like her subject. To take all that and put it in Greenwich Village, it's just...
How about New Hampshire?
New Hampshire could work.
All right, I've got another thing from Eudora. Then we'll let Eudora go back to the balcony.
She'd be bemused by all this, probably.
She was amused by a great deal.
I think most of us feel bemused much of the time, don't we?
It'd be nice.
Beyond a certain age, you're just sort of bemused by everything.
In this essay, Place in Fiction, she makes this remark. She says, which interests me, because I know what I think she means by it, but I'm interested to know what you think she means by it. She says, making reality real is art's responsibility. Making reality real is art's responsibility. When you hear that, what does it make you think? I don't know what it makes me think.
Well, that's a 20th century idea of modernism, where you're trying to reinvent the world in language that seems realistic. So you're trying to, it's like a hypnosis, you know, like let me tell you this story and I'll set the scene, as Joyce does so beautifully in Ulysses. But there's another kind of writing that's postmodernist, that's playful and parodistic, that doesn't make any attempt to do that. It says, I don't want to do that. Brecht is a good example in theater where the characters are, they're not meant to be real, they're not meant to be psychologically deep, they're meant to be like symbols. And so what Eudora Welty says is both true for her, but not necessarily true for other writers.
What I think she meant by it, and what I took away, so to say, from it, is that I mean, you and I, at least part of your life and all of mine, we're sort of realists. If we write the word tree, we want the reader to think of a tree. That's sort of basically what
you
realism.
are a realist,
yeah,
yes.
Then you're a realist. Well,
You're
sometimes
realist,
you are, and sometimes
but
you're not.
I'm not always a realist.
No, you're not.
I find that it's confining and it's something predictable. But, you know, the great realists are just great writers, and it's like Rembrandt compared to Francis Bacon. It's different kinds of art. And some people really like realism, and some people get bored with it, and they want something surreal.
But I'm going to get back to this idea of making reality real. I think that if you make day-to-day life your subject, if you're writing about who people love, what they hate, what they do, what they wish for, what they regret, that one of the things you're doing is you're asking the reader to stop whatever she or he is doing and say, look at this. This is about life. And in the process of doing that, you're averring that life is worth their notice, that life is ipso facto important. And by doing that, you are, in essence, affirming life is lived. And for me, that's what I take away from Eudora's line when she said making reality real is art's responsibility.
Well, that's true, but what is reality? For instance, we have physical reality, but there's a psychological, imaginative reality where you fall asleep at night and you're entering this realm of dreams and hallucinatory images. Somebody could say, well, that's not real because I can't see it if I'm in the room with you. But if you're experiencing dreams and images that are powerful, they're real. They're psychologically real. So realistic fiction can't really deal well with that, and realistic cinema and realistic art can't really deal with that other world. You have to move into worlds of the Gothic or fabulous fiction or fantasy or science fiction. You have to move into another realm because what we call reality is actually much more than just the physical and the objective.
Well, that's just, verisimilitude. That is to say, what is your way of representing reality? And it can be a melange. It can be myriad ways of representing reality.
Well, you yourself could experiment someday with writing something that's surreal, where you take a genre that you haven't written in. I mean, literally Richard Ford. I would like to see what you would do if you move into the kind of fabulous fiction that George Orwell was doing, for instance. Because Orwell is a psychological realist and very politically astute, and is very, a sense of history. But he was working with genres that were not realistic. Like Animal Farm, that's not realistic at all, except in some very basic and fundamental way. Robert Stone is another great 20th century, because it's 21st century now, realist who once said to me, he said, "You do things that I'd be afraid to do."
That's what I was about to say.
I'm not afraid to write about vampires and creatures like that in the Gothic genre, because to me, the vampire is a psychologically valid image of what I would call vampirism. It exists in the world. People suck one another's blood. They take one another's spirit. People devour one another all the time in real life. But if you want to make it into a drama, you go to the Gothic mode and you show an actual vampire or a Frankenstein monster. You can't really do that in realistic fiction. You have to find some other way of doing it, but it's not so shorthand. It's not so exciting, I think. To me, it's a challenge to go into the other genres and make them work the way the way Henry James does in the Turn of the Screw.
Turn of the Screw, right.
I mean, he's a great realist psychologically in virtually all of his writing, like 93% of all his writing is a psychological realist. But when he goes into ghost stories, it's a different kind of realism. And the Turn of the Screw is actually a great novella. I think it's just wonderful. But it does seem to have a supernatural element in it that realism doesn't usually accommodate.
Well, for me, you're holding up the specter of failure there. I don't do well with failure. I try to write things that I think are not going to make me fail, but in the most hideous ways. But you wrote an essay, which you know I like a lot. We've talked about it before, called
Notes on Failure.
In the Faith of the Writer. It's called Notes on Failure.
Notes on Failure.
You know, we spend a lot more time not succeeding than we spend succeeding, which makes writing be a lot like baseball, which means if you hit .333, you're going to be in the Hall of Fame. But you wrote something in that essay, which I, again, like very much. You said something I've never quite understood. You said the specter of failure haunts us more than the specter of failing. When you wrote that, remember what you meant by that?
Well, failing is something we may do every day as we try to write a couple of paragraphs, and we feel very frustrating and disappointing with what you're doing. So the sense of failing in process, I think, is something we learn to live with. But failure is like a noun. It's like some condition where the whole work is a failure. And that's like an accumulation of many days. So that, I think, is terrifying. To think you might spend 2 or 3 years on a novel, and when it's all done, it just somehow doesn't come together. That, to me, it would be heartbreaking to put all that investment. Yeah.
It probably would be to all of us, and yet it's the thing we always continually experience, in a sense, the possibility that I'm going to get 3 years into this baby, and it ain't going to be there.
Well, you just have to keep working on it and make it succeed. You just often a sense of failure is that you haven't quite finished it yet. You need more words.
You know, once you and I were talking, I remember very well, and I told you, I said, the place I like to be in writing novels is in the middle. I like to be in the middle of where I can't even remember or touch the beginning, and I can't predict or touch the end. And you at least audibly shuddered when I said that. And I wonder why it made you shudder. I would think that, I would have thought that would have been true of you, but I don't think it is true of you.
No, because I have to see the ending. I have to see the very last scene. I have to see the last sentence and last paragraph to know where I'm going. And you seem to say like you don't know exactly where you're headed. It's like getting in your car and just driving, randomly around and hoping you'll get to a destination.
No, that's what you said. I said. I didn't say that.
No, you just said a minute ago you're in the middle and didn't know where it's going.
I'm not writing the end and I'm not writing the beginning anymore.
But you know the end.
Well, don't you get sometimes to the end of something which you think you have known all these years, and suddenly you get to the end and it isn't the end anymore? Like my little story, Communist. I thought I knew the end, and I got to the end, and it wasn't the end suddenly. When I wrote Independence Day, I got to the end that I wanted to write, and it was the wrong end. And I just had to kind of lop it off and slam on another one.
Well, we don't want to make too much of these things, Well,
but that's exactly what we're doing. That's all my life is, making too much of these things.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Writers are people who make too much of things. But I remember Toni Morrison, who was for a while my friend and colleague at Princeton. She retired some years ago from Princeton. But when she was there, I got to know her a bit. And she said when I wrote The Bluest Eye, I think she was in her 40s then, she said, I wasn't able to do a certain thing. I wasn't able to write a certain scene. I just wasn't ready yet. So she went back years later and she revised the novel. She said, now I'm ready to do it. So at that time, the novel that she published was very celebrated and it made her quite famous, and it's an excellent novel. But what we thought was a complete novel and what she thought was complete and critics thought, then later on, like 20 years later, she thought, well, no, I didn't get it right, I'm going to do it again. So that's another level of the apprehension of your own work. Like when you wrote Communist, and one day you thought it was or wasn't quite ended, and another day you ended it. Then 40 years later, you read it again and think, oh no.
I love it.
What I should have done. Yeats was rewriting some of his poetry on his deathbed. So when you're on your deathbed, you'll say, Christina, let me see that story again. Oh no, I gotta.
That ain't
and
gonna
Christina
happen.
will take the pen away. She says, no, Richard, it's perfect. No, I can do it better. You know.
That points to something interesting, I think. Art is the daughter of time.
Yeah.
In that way. And what it means is that everything that we do, every poem we write, every story we write, exists both on our desk and as we write it at a certain period.
Yes.
And once that period lapses and life goes on, and maybe you do something else and maybe you don't, that piece of work is immured back in that moment.
Absolutely.
So I try not to go back and reassess something that I did years on, because I know whatever I did at the time I wrote it, I did it the best I possibly could. And I knew that that it exists in time, and that time is now gone.
Well, another thing too, and maybe you do the same thing. So we stand up sometimes and read our work, and as I read it, I started editing it because there's some sentences I don't want to say all those words, you know. And so I'm thinking, did I need them originally? Maybe I didn't really need them. So there was a story of mine that was going to be in an anthology edited by John Updike. And many people in the anthology were reading their work for an audiobook. And he said, will you read your story? And I looked at it, and I said, I really can't read it, because if I read that, I would want to edit it. And I couldn't do that, because it has to be the story that was there. I mean, I couldn't just have a recording that skipped a whole lot of it, you know. So he got a little irritated with me. They had to hire a professional actor to read it, but I thought, if I read that story, there's no way I'm going to read all those words, because today I wouldn't write all those extra sentences. It was too long by a bit, you know.
But that's not typical of you, is it?
Well, I'm not confronted with that very often. It's when, say somebody from, I don't know when you first started publishing, 1980s or so?
1975.
Okay. Somebody comes up to you and says, Richard, read this to us. And you're looking at this material you haven't seen in a long time, and you start reading it, and you say, oh, I want to edit this. And they say, you can't edit it. You'd find such a frustration there, because now you feel you could write it a little bit better.
Right.
But that's why it's good not to look at it.
You know, I think that's one of the things that Eudora did in her life. She had some party pieces, which were great stories, of course. The One of Why I Live at the P.O., A Worn Path, two or three others.
Powerhouse.
And she would read those stories over and over,
yes,
because she knew that all the words were right.
Yes.
She knew that she wasn't going to revisit the whole instigation of the story and have to, in some ways, rue it or find that there were too many words in a sentence.
Yes, exactly. And the stories that we tend to read aloud are dramatic and have a more dialogue, maybe. The ones that are introspective, that maybe we love more, we don't read to people because they're not exciting.
Actually, Christina and I read all of my books aloud before we published them, and that's my little hedge against visiting them later and regretting something. I feel like if I can say the things as a last gesture of keeping them in my life and then passing them on, if I can say them and account for every jot and every pause and every sentence break, then I think that's as close as I'm going to get to making them right.
Yes, that's very good. And some writers do read out loud, or they think they sort of hear their own voices, and you go over and over. Try to get it right.
You're trying to get it because you're giving it to somebody else. You're asking somebody else to take their good, sweet time and read it and make use of it. And so the best, the most, the least, everything you can do is to try to make it as good as you can make it, not just dash it off and hand it over. Another question. What do you think is again, I know the answer to this question for myself. What do you think is your largest weakness as a writer? You can't say nothing, you can't say everything. This is church, you have to tell the truth. Gosh,
I wouldn't have any idea how how to begin to answer something like that. I think we all move toward our strengths, and if there are weaknesses, we don't pursue them. You know, we were talking about realism and surrealism a few minutes ago, and perhaps you were joking a little, but you probably have an instinct that you couldn't write a ghost story, and so you didn't bother writing it. You don't have to write a ghost story. It's Richard Ford had a brilliant career without ever writing a ghost story. I probably would not be able to write a situation comedy. I don't feel that it's a genre that interests me at all. It has zero interest to me, or conventional romance. I have to have something a little bit lurid or twisted or weird. It has to go into some other realm where it's unexpected, or somebody goes like this, oh, why did she do that? I mean, I wouldn't be able to write something that I thought was conventional. So I don't know if that's a weakness or not, but it's what we're interested in. You know, like there's certain things I'm sure both Richard and I have written about boxing. The boxers learn where their skills are, and then that's what they do. They don't try to do the other thing that they can't do.
Well, that's the kind of theory of art which interests me in a way, that the aesthetic figure that a piece of art makes is the figure by which the artist avoids all of the things she or he doesn't do very well.
Well, the best example in the 20th century is Jackson Pollock,
Right.
and maybe de Kooning. See, they just demolished the idea of figurative art or representational art, and instead of doing human figures, which is pretty hard to do, like Picasso was just a great artist, he could do the human figure beautifully. They didn't try to do that at all. Jackson Pollock invented a whole new kind of art where the canvas is on the floor, and he's throwing the paint around, and he's doing things, this kinetic, sensuous, physical art that was really revolutionary and astonishing. Like, he wouldn't have been able to do the beautiful little things that Winslow Homer was doing, or Rembrandt. And so maybe he didn't even try. I'm not sure what his biography is, but he made this great art. And now when we see a Jackson Pollock on the wall in the museum, it is so beautiful. It's so exciting, and it has a delicacy and a beauty to it that, that's really great. So he found his way that his genius would be expressed even though he couldn't do the conventional art. And I think that's what we're all looking for. We're looking for the way in which we can do something that's somewhat new and special, because we don't even want to try to do something that's been done already.
Interesting. I think that's probably right. We've agreed about something.
Well, we were talking about George
Yes.
Saunders in the New Yorker, but you haven't read that story yet. It's in this week's New Yorker. But you read other George Saunders. Now, George Saunders does something very different. It's very sort of anti-realist sort of writing. And one could have a whole symposium on whether is that more satisfying to read than Richard Ford or James Joyce or Faulkner? Or is it somehow a different kind of experience? And somebody else might say, well, it's exciting because it's so different. It's very auditory. There isn't a sense of place at all. It's more just some people's voices. So it's a different kind of writing. I would be tempted to experiment with that kind of writing personally, but I don't feel it would please me so much as it does evoking a place. To me, that's very satisfying to me, to evoke a place.
You and I, you and Ray, Christina and I, we didn't have children in our life, and yet we write about children often. What do you think is the trick to writing about children and making them interesting on the page when they seem to be so uninteresting in life?
Well, there are different ways of writing about children. One is they have the child's perspective, as in the beginning of The Portrait of an Artist as a young man. James Joyce sort of tries to evoke the language of the child from that perspective. But I think probably most adult writers are writing about children from a little distance. You know, they're they're being seen rather than evoked. And in that case, often the child is not the center of the drama. The child could be like a pawn or a symbol or something.
But in first-person narrations, you know, the novel that you just published this year, My Life as a Rat.
Well, she's a girl. She's about 11 when it starts, so she's not.
That still counts as a child in my estimation, don't you?
She's remembering. Well, she's about 26 years old, telling the story, and so she's kind of remembering it. And you could have a perspective where you're an adult, but you're remembering your child self. It's a little different from actually being the child self.
Well, you avoided that nicely.
I think it depends on what you're trying, really what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, a child's future is in front of it, her, him, and in that moment of transition from adolescence to childhood into something that might be more traditionally responsible is necessarily dramatic. We think, whether it is or isn't, we can impose that sense of drama on it. For me, writing about children, the thing that I do to sort of lift it up out of the dross of what kids say is that I try to put responsible lines into the mouths of children. I try, in other words, to make children talk more like adults rather than like children actually do talk. So,
yes.
I mean, it's a trompe-l'oeil of a kind.
It's stylized. That's very true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. You won the Prix Feminin in France, and that's a wonderful prize because it is an all-female jury, and it was a prize that was originated by Colette early in the 20th century, and it makes me wonder how you feel about these books that you work so hard to make in English and to sweat over and slave over, be committed to another language, which is a sort of a buried question in some ways about translation, which sometimes it happens when you have a book translated. Someone will be doing what you and I are doing, and they will retranslate something back into English from the French or from the German, and what you hear is something that just scares you to death because it's completely different from anything that you ever imagined it would be. Yeah. And I wonder how you feel about having your books translated into another language.
Probably just neutral or zero. I don't have a whole lot of feelings to spare, so I'm not going to worry about. Just think we were published in China.
Yeah.
And can you imagine what it is? Like, no, you can't imagine at all how it's been translated. So I would say let's not just even go there to think about that.
Oh, I go there all the time. I love to go there because for me,
but do you read are you reading the translation in Chinese? You can't read it?
No, I don't read it. I don't read them at all.
So you don't know what it is?
You try to get good translators, try to get people that you talk to and help and assist.
How would you know?
Well, you don't know.
They're they're like politicians. They pretend to know something. They pretend.
So in other words, you just avert your gaze and block your ears.
I don't have anything to do with choosing translators. All around the different countries that publish my books, they hire them in the publishing. I mean, I wouldn't have any idea who to hire in China or Japan or Israel. How do you? I mean, how
yes, to some extent I do.
Really?
But not in China. It's true. Not in China.
I
no.
have a lovely woman translator in Paris, whom I met many times. She basically, her whole life is poor person. It's really sad. She does my writing. I mean, so I've stood beside her. We've been like interviewed together. And
now you're telling me the truth here. I'm glad you're getting around to this.
She's a petite woman, and she has like a doomed look in her eyes because she spent years translating my books. That's what she does. So she's kind of standing there. And she's very serious. And so I was being interviewed, and I said, oh, she just adds things when she wants to. And that was like a joke. You know, like we might joke about something, and this translator was so stunned that I would say something like that.
Yeah, they're very serious about what they do.
And I thought, well, that's a joke, you know. Hello, how do you say joke in French? Like, but she stood there.
Joke.
She was just astonished that I would joke about that. But in fact, in Romanian, I hadn't the faintest idea what. I mean, maybe they mixed the two of our writing together and something. Maybe they took some paragraphs from your story and put them right in the middle because they didn't like what I was writing. And we have no idea what they're doing.
I always say to the people who translate my books, make it better in French, make it better in
That's
Lithuanian,
right.
make it better in Chinese than it is in English. That's all I ask, because you have an advantage over me. You start with the text. I start with nothing.
That's right. But then if they get a little bored in the middle, they fall asleep or they're bored, they say, oh, well, this is kind of a slow chapter here, but let's just cut it. So you're never going to know that. In fact, your novels in other languages are very short, Richard.
Not in German, they're not.
The translators say, oh, we're throwing extra stuff out.
I have one last question to ask you, Joyce, before we end this service.
Ending our friendship, too.
No, we'll survive. We've survived 35 years. We can survive. Everybody's always asking writers from the South and Mississippi, they always say, why are there so many writers from Mississippi? Why are there so many writers from the South? I have my own set of answers to that, which we don't need to go into. Do people ask you that about writers from New York? Why are there so many writers from New York?
There are too many writers in New York. And not enough readers.
Yeah.
I think the standard answer, which I should give since it's a plausible answer, is that in the South, generally, there may be a storytelling tradition. No.
Not in my family.
That's the answer. I think people who don't even have it in their families just say that now because it seems like the answer that you give. In my family, my granddaddy always told the story,
Right,
and then they had the guitar, and they told it.
It's baloney. It's baloney.
None of it was true, but on the other hand, that might help to explain it. Whereas where I come from, people didn't even talk. They didn't like one another well enough to tell a story. Like,
well, where I come from, people talk way too much.
you want a story about your grandpappy? Well, we won't want to give it to you because we didn't like grandpappy.
You've been very kind today. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you very much.